Think back to the foundations of backward design. We're at the point in the process where we've created learning goals and outcomes, we've designed assignments, and carefully chosen and organized our content. Now we need to consider the most effective ways for students to use content during class time. How can they practice the skills they need to successfully complete the assignments, which ultimately demonstrates that they are meeting the learning outcomes? How can we choose teaching methods that model the thinking processes we want students to do? For many of us, our initial mental schema of learning in a classroom is of an expert teacher who presents information, and novice students who simply retain that knowledge in the same structure held by the experts. Presenting information is an important part of the classroom, but the research also shows that students learn best when they're given low-stakes opportunities to practice transferring knowledge to a new context, finding meaning in the knowledge, and identifying patterns in that material. Knowing how students learn best can guide our decisions about what we do with that time together in the classroom. Of course, learners need to have some foundational knowledge to build on and utilize. All students are introduced to this foundational knowledge in what we call first exposure. The higher order thinking we usually value in our courses comes through more in-depth processing of that knowledge. This is where the cognitive gymnastics that experts are able to demonstrate are practiced and refined. Balancing opportunities for first exposure and processing of knowledge is another set of considerations for our choices about teaching methods. First exposure happens when a student is presented with a set of information for the first time. Many of us assume and hope this happens before class with the assigned reading. But we know that students sometimes arrive not having done that reading. Other times, we prefer to be that first source students hear from before they even approach the reading. We may often then position ourselves, either intentionally or unintentionally, as the source of that first exposure. This can result in a passive student role, where students simply receive the knowledge we present, creating a very teacher-centered classroom, with the teacher doing most of the cognitive work. It's not inherently bad to be teacher-centered. Often students need to hear things from different perspectives. And as the content experts, a teacher-centered strategy means we get to provide the organization or examples that will make the knowledge meaningful to students. This is one side of the continuum of possible teaching strategies. The other side represents an emphasis on the processing of the information, where students are using the classroom time for more output than input. They're actively engaging in the material by practicing with it. We call this end of the spectrum student-centered. We have found that using this continuum is a helpful way of organizing possible teaching strategies. This table shows only a handful of the options. There are many others that we can choose from, so this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. Some of these strategies may be familiar to you already, others may not. We'll look at these groups of strategies and talk about the underlying reasons to choose from a particular category, and some best practices for implementing them in our courses. The in-practice section of this unit has examples of Ohio State faculty utilizing some of these strategies in real courses. If you would like more information about any of these strategies, we suggest exploring the further resources section of this unit. Most of them can be facilitated through digital tools or used in an online course. The materials in the Teaching with Technology unit will specifically address these options. One of the best ways to guide the decision-making process is to look back at our learning outcomes. What do we want students to be able to do with our material? Let's start with the teaching-centered strategies. Why would we want to choose these? The strategies on our list all provide students with exposure to the content, which is often, as we discussed, a useful way to introduce the learner to the material for the first time. It can also serve to illustrate or demonstrate how we view and use that knowledge within our discipline. When using these teaching strategies, we do have some best practices to keep in mind. The first is thinking about the importance of storytelling. If these strategies are about introducing material, we have to think about how we tell the story of that content. Stories naturally have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Think about a book you love. Just as the first chapter should catch your interest and prompt you to continue on, in our class, how can we introduce the content in a way that will engage the students with what is about to unfold? We might choose something controversial about the topic that day, ask a provocative rhetorical question, or introduce the main characters of our story. The idea is to draw in the audience, in this case our students, so that they want to see what happens next. Now let's consider how the story ends. How do we wrap up a class with a satisfying conclusion? We could summarize the main points or provide a preview of what happens next. The main point here is to think about content as something that has an organization. Students need to see that organization explicitly laid out for them. One way to create that is to limit the information we share to 2 or 3 main concepts. This doesn't mean we only talk about 2 or 3 things in a class, but successful content stories chunk lots of smaller pieces of information into 2 or 3 meaningful, overarching concepts. As we know from the Learning About Learning unit, experts are great at seeing chunks of knowledge, but we're not always great at making those chunks explicit to our novices. We also know from the literature on learning that prior knowledge plays an important role in both memory and understanding. So as we tell our story, we can activate that prior knowledge by providing lots of examples, illustrations, analogies, and applications. Since teacher-centered strategies tend to rely heavily on student listening, how can we create opportunities for students to strengthen those listening skills? A few ways to do this are by pausing throughout a lecture in order to help students write their notes. We can encourage clarification questions from students and ask questions regularly, which is different than asking "any questions?" as a way to transition to the next point in the lecture. We may also want to ask students, particularly in the early weeks of a course, to take a few minutes to compare lecture notes with a neighbor. Having a perspective on how their peers may be organizing their notes can be a quick way to have students learn better ways to organize what they're hearing in our lectures. However we choose to provide first exposure in the classroom, it is helpful to get the reactions of our students to the material being taught on a regular basis. This helps us refine and enhance our practice. One way to do this is the minute paper, where you simply ask students to take 1 minute to write down the most valuable or muddiest point from a class session. These can be on paper or online and needn't be graded, so they take very little time both in and out of class. You'll find more specific examples of how to collect quick feedback in the unit on getting feedback. In the center of the continuum are strategies that give opportunities to both introduce and reinforce information through some manipulation or practice. At least a few of these strategies are likely to be unfamiliar. Some may look intriguing, and others may seem overwhelming. Later in this unit, you'll have a chance to watch Ohio State teachers put these strategies into action. And in further resources section, you can read more descriptions and application ideas for a large number of them. These strategies provide students with some first exposure to content, as well as some processing time. They allow students the opportunity to apply and practice with the foundational knowledge. An additional benefit to using these strategies is that as teachers, we'll be more able to assess how well the outcomes are being attained by students, because much of what they're doing in these strategies happens in real time in front of us in the classroom. We want to incorporate these strategies early in the term, so students can anticipate what the classroom and learning environment will be like from the very beginning. Introducing a discussion in week 6 of a term, for example, may not be as successful as we might have hoped if students have spent 5 weeks expecting to sit quietly during lecture. We also want to vary the structure of these strategies. Some could be done as individual work, in pairs, small or large groups, or even as a whole class. Think pair shares and case studies, for example. They could easily be done in groups of 2 or 3. Discussions can range from small groups to the whole class. We want to choose variations of groupings that will allow the most number of students to contribute and practice. For example, doing case studies in a group of 8 students means we will likely have 6 disengaged students. However, doing case studies in a pair might limit the range of perspectives each student gets to engage with. Consider how these strategies could provide a scaffolding where they start on a small or less difficult scale and then move to more complex or larger structures. For example, doing pair work can build up to a full class discussion or debriefing activity. More students will feel comfortable participating because they first had a lower stakes environment to practice with the ideas. We can use Bloom's levels and types of questions to guide both our choice of student actions during the activities, as well as any scaffolding we need. As we weave more active practice opportunities into our classes, we have choices to make about timing, formality, and length. We can choose a more open-ended activity where we don't have set expectations for the artifact or output of their work, such as a discussion where multiple perspectives could be acceptable. Or we might plan a highly organized activity where we have a clear expected outcome, such as a lab simulation. In either case, it's important to leave time for an adequate debrief where we share takeaway points or a conclusion about what the students learned during the activity. Now let's look at the student-centered end of the spectrum. This is where students are spending all or the majority of their time playing with ideas, processing, and practicing skills using that foundational knowledge. In addition to allowing students to process material, one purpose of student-centered strategies is to provide more frequent and immediate feedback to students. Knowing how well they're mastering material can help students become more metacognitive learners and take a more active role in their own learning process. Having more time and data about their progress and time to adjust their approach to learning will ultimately help more students meet our learning outcomes. The time spent grappling with and applying information also gives students a chance to create personal connections to the material and allows for student-generated knowledge to complement and extend the examples and content we choose. Just as many of these strategies may not be things you have personal experience with as a student, not everyone in your courses will know what to expect from a course that is heavily student-centered. We can prepare students for success with these types of strategies by being explicit about the learning benefits and how they help students meet the course outcomes. The exercises and activities won't feel extraneous when they are shown how it connects to the course as a whole. Plan for facilitation of the activity. This sounds pretty obvious. Of course, you'll plan your activity, but a new strategy, particularly one that relies on students to take a very active role in their learning, may require a different type of planning than a teacher-centered activity. Beyond the specific steps of the activity you'll outline, you'll want to ask yourself some other questions. Where do you anticipate students needing extra support or guidance to make this practice with the material effective? How and when will you introduce the activity to make it clear? How will you articulate your expectations for how students should contribute to the activity? What can they do outside of class to more effectively prepare for in-class? To this last point, clear directions are especially crucial in student-centered teaching strategies. If you are counting on students to prepare something before class or to produce some kind of artifact of their work during class, consider writing the directions down ahead of time and letting a peer look for areas students may misunderstand. As you plan for a student-centered strategy, include realistic timing. A role-play activity or debate can rarely be introduced and completed by the whole class in only 30 minutes. And you'll want to leave time for a debrief or a wrap-up summary of the main ideas that students should leave with. Without this step, students often are concerned that they don't know what specific things they should have taken away from the experience, particularly how it may relate to future tests or assignments. Sometimes we may want to assign grades or points to one or all of the student-centered activities we use in class, particularly since we may not be able to watch every individual student processing or practicing a skill during every activity. We may want to assess the artifact or work handed in afterwards. We would then use explicit grading criteria aligned with the learning outcomes. For ideas about how to assess student-centered activities, more information is available in the units on assessing learning and grading for learning. Hopefully, we're now familiar with the range of teaching strategies, but how do we choose the right ones for our courses? First, we don't want to decide on a strategy simply because it sounds fun or innovative. It should be a purposeful activity that is directly aligned with learning outcomes. If your outcome is about applying information to different global situations, it may make sense for your students to practice that skill with an activity in class first, before you actually share your own answers. If your outcome is to build specific communication skills, it would be helpful to have students practice those skills in class before demonstrating them on a high-stakes assignment or paper. Second, we don't want to choose a strategy and decide to drop it into a class session without considering the work that may be involved on our end as teachers. Some strategies can be pulled out of your back pocket with only a few minutes' notice, and others need a semester or more of planning to implement. Either way, you'll want to plan for how to clearly introduce the activity and how you'll help students feel more confident in executing the steps involved in it. Usually, they'll need time and more than one experience with the strategy before using it effectively to practice their thinking skills. So don't be discouraged if you try a new strategy once and find it didn't work as you had hoped. You'll want to give at least 2 opportunities for students to get acclimated to your process and your expectations. The first time they come to a flipped classroom, there'll be some hiccups on both your end and theirs, but given some time, everyone will settle in. Finally, we can't be too hard on ourselves when we introduce a new strategy to our teaching repertoire. It takes time and practice to get into a rhythm, whether you're using active lecture, discussions, or maybe team-based learning. Things might fail, but it doesn't mean you should give up. Get some feedback from students. Work one-on-one with a UCAT consultant or a peer to help you tweak and refine your efforts. Your next task will be to watch a variety of examples of these strategies by Ohio State faculty. You'll then complete a critical reflection that will assist you in choosing strategies that align with your course-specific goals and outcomes. While we don't expect you'll be able to realistically integrate all of these strategies into your teaching in a single term, we encourage you to explore at least one new strategy from across each category. Explore one to build your on-the-spot toolkit that can be pulled out at a moment's notice, another that might need a bit of planning but can be integrated during the middle of a term, and at least one that may require more advanced planning and can be integrated into a future course or course update.